Hi everybody, welcome back to Green Tubers. In this video I'm going to walk you through how I make sourdough bread and how it fits into our daily routine. Like lots of other people, I have tried making sourdough bread in the past, and unfortunately I'd failed in the past. I just couldn't get it to click. So the first COVID lockdown gave me both the opportunity and the need to routinely produce good bread for the family, because getting out to the shops from where we are in our rural location was quite tricky. So I watched quite a lot of other YouTube channels, YouTube videos on how to make sourdough bread, and eventually came up with a routine which is both successful in that it produces good sourdough, obviously that's pretty important, but also a routine that is will fit around daily life and isn't too complicated. So what I'm going to show you in this video is a slightly bastardized process that I've taken from a couple of other channels, and I'll credit them below, and come up with something that really works for me.
So obviously the first thing you need to make sourdough is a starter. Now this is my starter. It doesn't look like much, but then it doesn't need to be much. That tiny amount in there is more than enough to be home to the millions of bacteria needed to make my sourdough. I'm not going to show you how to make a sourdough starter. There are plenty of videos out there which will show you how to do that. My tip would be just to go and grab a spoonful of somebody else's. It's probably the easiest solution and stops you from having to faff around. Now the idea with this is I'm going to put in 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. That I'll just give it a mix around, and we will pop it on the side for the night in the warmth, and in the morning it'll be all puffed up and ready to use. I'm going to chuck in 50 grams of water, give or take, slightly over, but that's not a big deal. And I'm going to put in 50 grams of flour. Now I'm using wholemeal rye here. Oops, let's reset that. I'm using wholemeal rye because wholemeal rye lasts particularly well in the fridge for a few days. There we go, right. Okay, so having weighed it out, I'm now going to mix it up. So I'm mixing both the flour and the water and the scrapings from my previous starter. And that is about it. So now you can see it's all mixed up, and I'm just going to put the lid on, not very tightly, and just leave that on the side for the moment.
It's now the morning after, and my sourdough starter is ready. I don't know if you can see, but there are plenty of bubbles in there, and if I'm not sure how well this will work, but give it a whirl. If I give a bit of a scoop, you can see it's got quite an airy texture to it.
The next job is to mix all my ingredients together to make up the dough. So I'm going to take 100 grams of my sourdough starter, give or take. It doesn't have to be totally accurate, and I make sure I just leave a bit in the jar. And as described yesterday, that can now go back in the fridge, ready for the next time. My next two ingredients are 20 grams each of olive oil and salt. Next, I've got 950 grams of flour. Of course, there's 50 grams of flour from the starter as well, so I end up with a 1 kilo batch.
Now a brief interlude on flour, which I forgot to shoot when I originally did this video. You don't want to use the wholemeal rye flour for for the majority of the flour for the bread. And the reason for that is that rye is relatively low in gluten content, and you need the gluten to create the stretch. The stretch helps to contain and then allows the air bubbles to form, which gets you nice fluffy bread. If you use wholemeal rye for all of the loaf, then you're likely to end up with a baked brick by the end of it. So what you're looking for your flour is just strong, they call it strong flour, bread flour, and that usually means a protein or gluten content of above 12%. And that's written on the side of the packet, but any strong bread flour will usually do. Personally, I usually mix it up, so I'll use a half to 2/3 white flour, and then the remainder I'll use wholemeal flour, but not always. I mix it up, sometimes doing all white. It also depends on the flour I've got. Some of the really good quality unbleached white flour is, to be honest, quite brown anyway, so I'll use less wholemeal for that instance. But generally it doesn't really matter, as long as you're using a good strong flour or a combination of strong flours with a reasonable protein content, you'll be fine. Just chuck in what you want, as long as it adds up to 950 grams, it'll be fine. Now, back to the rest of the video.
Spot on. And the last ingredient is 680 grams of cold water straight out of the filter. And again, I'm weighing this, not measuring it. And that's it. That's all my ingredients. My starter, olive oil, salt, flour, and of course water. Now when it comes to mixing this, you can use a wooden spoon. If you do use a wooden spoon, use this end, because it makes it a lot easier, and pick a wooden spoon without a hole in it, because otherwise it gets bunged up. I'm going to be lazy, however, and I'm going to use my mixer. If you use a mixer, that's absolutely fine. It does speed things up, but just take care not to over mix it. We're not actually trying to knead it, we're just trying to combine the ingredients. And that's it for mixing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to scrape off the dough hook. And the last thing to do for now is I'm just going to go around and scrape down the sides of the bowl, and then just give it a last shuffle to make sure I haven't missed any bits and there's no big clumps of flour or anything at the bottom, to make sure it's reasonably mixed. It looks good to me. There we go. Right, now lid on. I haven't got a proper lid, so I'm just going to use a plate. It's better than cling film. And then leave this for just 30 minutes before coming back and having a mix. Our first 30 minutes have gone past, and now it's time to give it a bit of a mix. Some of the videos I've seen in the past suggest wetting your worktop, getting the dough out and giving it a go over there, but I found that's unnecessary. I'm just going to keep it in the bowl. I'm going to wet my hands and give it a bit of a turn. All I'm doing is I'm grabbing the dough from the outside, putting it into the middle and turning and repeating that sequence. And for this first go, I'll probably do that 10 or 12 times, but don't count. Here we go. And that's it. At this point, if you do discover any bits that aren't particularly well mixed, you can give it a chance to give it a bit of a rub between your fingers and thumbs, and that's it. I mean, I wouldn't get too stressed if it's not entirely perfectly mixed, but if there are any lumps, definitely give those a bit of a work, and that should be it. And now we leave this for 2 hours and then repeat the sequence, and repeat and repeat and repeat for as much as you can during the day. Now I usually get my mix done when I first get up, so depending on how the kids are, somewhere around 6:30, 7 o'clock, something like that. And I'll repeat this through the day every 2 hours until about 5 o'clock. And to be honest, I'm not really, if I don't do it exactly the same number of mixes every time, I'm not going to get stressed. It just works. And if I'm like half an hour early or half an hour late with each one, again, I'm not going to worry about it too much. As long as there's some routine-ish and regular mixes throughout the day, then we're all good. So I've waited 2 hours. The lid's been on. I'm just going to take it off and have a look. Yeah, everything's kind of as expected. It's starting to, I don't know, go soft and a bit more, bit smooth looking, which it wasn't quite so much before. And I'm just going to repeat exactly the same trick. I'm going to wet my hand. I'm going to do some folds. I'm going to put the lid on and leave it for another 2 hours. After folding our dough every couple of hours today, it's finally time to turn them into something that looks a little bit more like a couple of loaves. So I've got my apron on because this is slightly messy sometimes, or I'm slightly messy, one of those two. What we're going to do is lightly flour our surface. For that, I've just got a sieve and pop a bit of flour on. There we go. Now for this next step, I've got 2 bits of sort of proper baking equipment, but the good news is they're both quite cheap. So the first is I've got a dough scraper, which is dead handy. And secondly, over here, I've got our baguette. I've got 2 of these, one for each of the loaves that we're going to make. And these are, I don't know, about 10 or 12 quid each, something like that. You can do without them, but I have tried. And the reality is they do make things quite a lot easier, mostly just because they help the dough not to stick, and it's a lot easier to get them out again afterwards. So I'm going to pop that to one side for a second. I'm going to get our dough out. Tip that out onto our floured work surface. Whoa, look at that. Get the last bits out. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold that in half a bit and then accurately-ish divide it up into 2. Now just move one of them to the side for a second. A bit more flour on bits there. Now, if we've done this right, we should have something which has now got flour on the underneath and is still sticky on the top. So we're going to make use of that stickiness. I'm going to fold it towards the middle and then fold it on towards the middle again. We get a bit of a roll. And if we do that, repeat that again, fold it into the middle, using that sticky edge which still remains there, and over it there again. Now we've got something which is nicely floured all over. We're going to add a little bit more flour to the top. Rub it over with our hands. Now this is one of those things where it's probably the only part of the whole sequence which actually requires any skill, but even so, it is probably really hard to screw it up. So don't get too worried about it, and even if it doesn't work, the bread will still turn out pretty good. So all I've done there now is I've tucked in one side, I'll spin it round, and then do that for the other. And again, that's mostly just for aesthetics, really. It doesn't really matter too much. A little bit more loaf-like when it comes out. And I've got something which is reasonably tight. I've been careful not to push it too hard, so it's still nice and sort of puffy and bouncy. You can see that. And then all I'm going to do is flour the inside of the baguette so it doesn't stick. And then I'm going to lift this thing up. Now I'm going to scoop it up from the underneath, and the floured side, the bit that's the top, will go into the bottom of this. There we go, and then plop it in. Job done. And so that when we get it out ready to bake, I can just tip it back, and the bottom side will then be on the bottom and the top will be on the top. But for now, it's upside down in the basket. Now, this will go into the fridge now for the night. I'll leave it in the fridge. It will continue to rise slightly. It'll form a crust. but that's okay. That's all to be expected. And yeah, that's it. So I'm going to do the next one. Get a tiny bit more flour. Chuck this in here. Job done. 2 baskets in the fridge for the night, ready to bake tomorrow. Now I've got my dough out of the fridge. It's risen slightly, it's got a bit of a crust on it, but that's to be expected, and that's absolutely spot on and ready to go. Now the biggest breakthrough I had when it came to baking sourdough was using what's called a Dutch oven. Actually, it's just a regular casserole dish, but it works absolutely fine. You can see it's gone a bit black from me repeatedly baking bread in it. And I'm going to put this empty into the oven to warm up at 250 degrees, and then we'll be ready to bake. The oven and my improvised Dutch oven are now up to temperature. They're up to 250 degrees, so I'm going to get them out and put the dough in. Now the reason for using the Dutch oven with the lid on is as the dough cooks, it releases water, and the steam stays within the lidded oven, or the lidded Dutch oven, and that steam helps keep the outer edge of the bread soft, and it will allow it to expand further before it has hard crust. So we're going to cook it for 20 minutes at 250 degrees, and then I'm going to take the lid off and cook it for another half an hour at 200 degrees. So I'm just going to turn the temperature down a little bit. And that will then, once it's risen, allow a nice crust to form. Now I'm going to grab it out of the oven. I'm going to try and do this as quickly as possible to try and keep as much heat in the casserole dish as possible. So here we go. I'm going to put a little sprinkle of olive oil into here. And then, oh, don't need those yet, tip this in. There we go. Now I'm just going to give it a bit of a shuffle, and that helps spread the olive oil around the base. Now the next thing I need to do is score the top. Hang on a second while I grab a knife. Now you can do all sorts of fancy patterns in this. You're meant to use like called a lame, which is essentially like a razor blade, but any sort of serrated edge will also do quite a nice job. And I'm just going to score some lines in the top. Now this isn't just for effect. This is to allow the bread to grow a little bit more and allow some stretch basically in the top. Now I'm going to pop the lid back on, and this goes straight back in the oven. Right, so the first 20 minutes have gone past, and we're about to take the lid off. Aren't we, Oliver? It's time to take our bread out and see what we've got. So here it is, straight out of the oven. I'm going to put it on a rack to cool off a bit. Now you can feel as soon as you get it out whether you've got it right or not, because if it feels still quite heavy, then you should have put it in for a bit longer. But you'll pretty quickly learn how your oven operates and what the right sort of timing is. So I'm just going to sit this here on the rack to cool down while I get on with the second one. Okay, so the oven's heated back up to 250 again, and it's time to repeat the sequence with the second loaf. Nice and easy. Okay, dash of olive oil. That just helps it not to stick. Chuck the bread in. dough at this point. Score as before. Pop the lid back on, and then back in the oven. Right, time to take out loaf number 2. Yeah, look at that. I don't know if you can hear that. It's got a pretty good crunch to it. Now actually the second one I cooked for slightly longer because when I divided up the dough, I didn't do a particularly good job of doing it evenly, which doesn't really matter. So the first one I cooked for my normal 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and actually did this one for closer to 20 and 35. So if you do find that you've not done a very good split, or if your dough's slightly bigger, then just cook it for a bit longer. And you may find that after a couple of goes, you'll learn that you have to do that anyway. Your oven might take a bit less time. But you know when it's ready. You'll learn when it's ready because the weight. And both of these are pretty lightweight. They look good, and yeah, who doesn't want to eat a nice loaf like that? Yummy. Hope that's been useful for you. If you do have any questions, then feel free to put something in the comments. I will put the full recipe in the description below, and yeah, good luck.